She slammed the cuffs on him, confident that no one would query her word. However, upon entering the courtroom, she came to the realization that she had committed the most significant error of her professional life. Damon Fletcher had consistently been a man who preferred to avoid conflict. His existence was deliberate and structured. He was not inclined to take risks. But none of that mattered when Officer Erica Manning entered that convenience store on a tranquil afternoon in Fort Worth, Texas. The establishment was primarily devoid of merchandise. Damon had arrived for a straightforward beverage and refreshment prior to his departure for home. He was just leaving the self-checkout when he suddenly felt a sharp, disquieting sensation that someone was observing him. "Sir, I require you to cease immediately." The voice was authoritative and piercing. Damon, bewildered, whirled and found himself gazing at a uniformed officer who leisurely rested a hand on her holstered weapon. "Officer Manning." He scanned the area, certain that there was a miscommunication. "Is there an issue?" Her demeanor was impenetrable. However, her posture indicated that she had already reached a conclusion. "I just observed you place an item in your pocket after scanning a few items. Would you be willing to provide me with your receipt?" Damon's brow furrowed as he shifted his satchel to his other hand. "I have recently made a payment. The register is available for your review." Manning's lips were pulled together in a narrow line. "I requested that you provide me with your receipt." Damon inhaled slowly before reaching into the plastic bag to retrieve the small scrap of paper. He extended it toward her, maintaining a deliberate pace. Manning grabbed it and gave it a cursory inspection before shaking her head. "Good effort. Empty your wallets." A few individuals had turned to observe, their gazes alternating between the two like spectators at a sporting event. Damon maintained his composure. "I do not possess any items in my pockets." Manning appeared to lose his composure abruptly. Hands pressed against the counter, Damon's mandible was clenched. This was not a matter of a missing item. She was not inspecting a receipt. He had witnessed this occur an inordinate number of times, in an inordinate number of locations, and with an inordinate number of individuals who bore similarities to him. "I informed you that I did not take anything," he stated, maintaining a steady tone. Manning's hand dipped toward her radio dispatch. "I have a potential suspect in the matter of shoplifting who is refusing to comply." Refusing to comply. Slowly, Damon exhaled. His hands were visible, and his voice was composed. He was standing still. However, none of that was significant. A young man in a company vest, who was employed as a store attendant, hesitated before proceeding. "Actually, I observed him paying for everything." Manning did not even raise her head. "Withdraw from this situation." Damon's pulse beat rapidly. He was already aware of the direction in which this was headed. "Look, you are making an error," he stated, his voice remaining unwavering. "I possess a law degree. I am aware of my privileges." Manning's laughter was brief and devoid of amusement. "Indeed, you may clarify your rights in the city." She grasped Damon's wrist before he could respond. At the instant her digits contracted, a decision briefly crossed his mind. He has the option to withdraw, request to communicate with a supervisor, or engage in a physical altercation. However, none of these actions would result in a positive outcome. Therefore he permitted her. The small store was rippling with tension, as the frigid metal of the restraint snapped against his skin. Manning's hold was firm as she directed him toward the exit, where her squad vehicle was waiting. Damon observed his reflection in the glass door of the store as they exited. He had previously observed numerous individuals in his position. However, he was now one of them for the first time. However, he was aware of a fact that Erica Manning was unaware of. This would not turn out as she had anticipated. Except for the occasional radio murmur, the journey to the station was entirely silent. Damon sat in the rear, his wrists bound, gazing out at the city as it passed by in a blur. He was aware that it was unwise to speak. Anything he said would be distorted, misinterpreted, and employed against him. Conversely, Manning appeared at ease, with one hand firmly planted on the steering wheel, and the other lying near her radio. She had likely performed this action on numerous occasions. She parked with a sense of finality at the station, and emerged, opening the rear door, as if she had just reeled in her most recent capture. "Let's depart." Damon did not demonstrate any resistance. He emerged with his head held high, and his jaws set. Manning led him past the front desk, and officers scarcely afforded him a glance during his time inside. She stated, "Shoplifting," and nonchalantly handed over his pocketbook and personal belongings to the officer who was on duty. Manning received a sideways gaze from the officer behind the desk, who appeared fatigued and possessed graying hair. "Is this a serious matter?" Manning shook his head. "Had to place him in custody." The individual was becoming increasingly antagonistic. Damon tightened his knuckles. Inhospitable. He had scarcely lifted his voice. However, the term hostile held a distinct connotation when it was associated with an individual such as him. A bar association card was extracted from Damon's pocketbook by a junior officer, who was likely in his early 30s. He briefly raised his gaze. "Are you a lawyer?" Damon exhaled through his nostrils. "Yes." Manning exhaled. "Indeed he is." The young officer's gaze narrowed as he turned the card over. "He is speaking the truth." Manning was the subject of his gaze. "Are you certain about this charge?" Manning's expression became increasingly tense. "He stole from the store." The young officer hesitated before turning to Damon. "Sir, do you have a lawyer?" Damon acknowledged his gaze. "I do not require one." Almost amused, the officer's expression was a gradual smirk. Before returning Damon's pocketbook, he briefly examined Manning. "Are you planning to represent yourself?" Damon acknowledged. "Indeed." Manning exhaled a brief, irritated breath and shifted her weight to her heel. "That is satisfactory. Process him." Damon was guided down a corridor, passing a series of holding cells. He had previously observed locations similar to this one, from the opposite perspective. He was now present, waiting, much like the men he had once fought to protect. He remained seated on the bench, observing the minutes pass by. He was aware of the mechanics of this. They would attempt to coerce him into entering into a plea agreement, by detaining him for as long as they could legally do so. Or even worse, allow him to remain in prison over the weekend, in order to instill a lesson in him. However, they were unaware of the identity of the individual with whom they were interacting. A guard entered as the door squeaked open. "You are scheduled to appear in court in the morning." Damon's mind was already engaged in the strategy, as he nodded. He would not merely establish his innocence, he would ensure that this never occurred to another individual in his position. Manning, however, continued to believe that she had already prevailed. Nevertheless, she was about to discover the extent of her error. The courtroom was considerably colder than Damon had anticipated. The polished wood of the judge's bench was illuminated by the intense glare of the fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. He sat at the defense table, his hands neatly folded in front of him, the weight of the shackles from the previous night still raw on his wrists. Officer Erica Manning stood confidently across the room, her uniform immaculate, and her expression inscrutable. This was ordinary to her. A straightforward example of a shoplifter, who was apprehended and is currently undergoing the same process as so many others who have come before him. She had not even bothered to verify the name on the docket. The judge, an elderly woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and keen eyes, adjusted her spectacles and briefly observed the prosecution. "Let us expedite this process. What fees are associated with this?" The prosecutor, a young man with an overconfident grin, rose to his feet. Damon Fletcher, the defendant, was apprehended for theft from a nearby convenience store. "Your Honor." Following his refusal to comply, Officer Manning observed the offense firsthand and subsequently detained him. Damon exhaled quietly, slightly moving his head. Lie-telling had initiated at an early stage. He was addressed by the magistrate. "Mr. Fletcher, do you have legal representation?" Damon stood, using his firm hands to fasten his suit jacket. "I consent, Your Honor. I shall be representing myself." The tiny audience in the rear was affected by a murmur. The prosecutor's arrogant expression was slightly tainted. Manning, on the other hand, provided very little response. The judge acknowledged. "Excellently. Mr. Fletcher, what is your method of plead?" "Not guilty." His voice remained unyielding and unruffled. The prosecution was the subject of the judge's gaze. "We should listen to the officer's testimony." Manning advanced with assurance. "Your Honor, I was on patrol when I entered the convenience store and observed the defendant pocket an item without paying. I approached him and requested to see his receipt, but he was unable to provide it. He subsequently became contentious and refused to adhere to my directives." Damon's cranium was slightly inclined. He had previously encountered unfavorable testimonies. However, this was particularly careless. He was addressed by the magistrate. "Mr. Fletcher, you were permitted to conduct a cross-examination." Damon adjusted his tie as he stood. He stepped forward, his hands resting gently on the defense table. "Officer Manning, you stated that you observed me removing an item and placing it in my pocket. Is this accurate?" "Yes." "And you assert that I failed to submit a receipt." "That is accurate." Damon paced slowly as he nodded. "Were there security cameras installed in the store?" Manning hesitated briefly. Nevertheless, Damon managed to grab it. "Yes, but that footage has not yet been reviewed." He addressed the prosecutor. "Did your organization request the footage?" The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. It was not considered necessary at the time. After allowing that to settle for a moment, Damon proceeded. "Officer Manning, you also mentioned that I declined to comply. In what manner?" Manning appeared to adjust. "You resisted my attempts to detain you, refused to empty your pockets when requested, and became aggressive." Damon nodded while pressing his lips together. "Interesting." He addressed the magistrate. "Your Honor, I would like to present Exhibit A as evidence. This is my purchase receipt, which was in my possession at the time of my arrest." He approached the bailiff and presented the fragment of paper, which was carefully folded. The judge examined it, her eyebrows slightly raised. She glanced over her spectacles at Manning and stated, "This receipt demonstrates that Mr. Fletcher did in fact pay for all of his items." "Officer, did you inspect this during the arrest?" Manning's posture became rigid. "I must have failed to notice it." Damon returned his attention to her. "You must have failed to notice it." The pressure in the room had changed, despite the fact that his voice was consistent. Manning's mandible clenched. Damon permitted the silence to persist for an appropriate duration. "Officer, do you have any body camera footage of the arrest?" Manning hesitated once more. The body camera was not functioning properly. The judge's pupils contracted. "That was not addressed in your report." Damon folded his arms. "So the receipt that established my innocence, the absence of security footage review, and the absence of body camera footage were all disregarded." In a subdued voice he chuckled. "Officer Manning, were you certain that I stole something, or did you simply determine that I resembled an individual who would?" The room was reverberated by a sudden acute inhalation. Manning's face reddened, and her hands balled into fists at her sides. However, this was only the beginning. The genuine unraveling was imminent. The courtroom was enveloped in a profound silence. Manning's expression was impenetrable as she maintained her posture. However, Damon could observe the tension in her jaw and the subtle transfer of her weight from one foot to the other. She had anticipated a swift, uncontested prosecution, a conviction that would be easily approved. Yet, the floor was now collapsing beneath her. Damon maintained a composed and controlled tone in his voice. "Officer Manning, let us revisit your report. You asserted that I was hostile and opposed compliance." Manning slightly raised her head. "That is accurate." He agreed. "Could you provide a detailed account of the actions I took that were hostile?" She hesitated for a brief moment. However, the delay was sufficient. "You declined to empty your pockets. You elevated your voice." Damon inclined his head. "I understand. So, is it deemed hostile to raise my volume in response to a false accusation?" Manning declined to respond. Damon returned his attention to the magistrate. "Your Honor, I would like to present Exhibit B, which is video testimony from a store employee who observed the entire incident." The prosecutor abruptly rose from his seat. "Objection. This witness was not disclosed prior to the trial." The judge dismissed the matter with a dismissive gesture. "The decision has been overturned. Let us hear it." The bailiff activated the play button on a screen located at the front of the courtroom. The indistinct footage depicted a young store attendant who was seated at a desk, his eyes twitching nervously as he spoke. "I observed everything. Damon Fletcher, the individual in question, utilized the self-checkout system to acquire his merchandise. Subsequently, the officer entered the room, briefly observed him, and proceeded directly toward him. She neglected to examine the security footage. She simply made an assumption." The courtroom was enveloped in silence. Damon scrutinized Manning's visage. Her hands were clasped behind her back, and she was rigid. However, her pupils briefly flickered. Damon addressed her. "Officer Manning, Did you take the time to inquire about the store clerk's observations prior to making the arrest? Manning's mandible clenched. Or did you determine that I was guilty the moment you encountered me? In Manning's temple, a vein became twitchy. That is not the case. Slowly, Damon nodded. Okay, let's deconstruct it. No witness statements, no body camera footage, and no security footage reviewed. Just your word against mine. Except that I now possess a receipt, an eyewitness. And he turned to the judge. Your Honor, I would like to request a review of Officer Manning's previous arrest reports. The prosecutor's chair collided with the floor. I object. This case is not germane to that. Damon grinned. In my opinion, it is of extraordinary importance. The credibility of Officer Manning's testimony today is directly impacted by the existence of a pattern of unlawful arrests. The judge briefly examined him before nodding. Request granted. The prosecutor's posture was slightly slouched. Damon folded his palms on the table. Officer Manning, have you ever been the subject of wrongful arrests? Her complexion diminished. No. Damon emitted a gradual assent. Interesting. He turned to the bailiff, who was already displaying files on a screen. Because public records indicate that you have received 3 complaints of racial profiling in the past 2 years. The courtroom was filled with a murmur. Manning's fingertips moved at her sides. Damon's voice remained unwavering as he returned to her. Officer, what was the number of cases involving black men? The silence was prolonged. Manning's voice was strained when she eventually spoke. That is not relevant to this case. Damon elevated his eyebrow. Does it not? She slightly adjusted her gaze toward the prosecutor, but he was already massaging his temple, evidently regretting the decision to pursue this case to trial. Before speaking again, Damon allowed the gravity of the situation to settle. Your Honor, it is evident that Officer Manning did not only act with bias and negligence, but also falsely arrested me at this juncture. I request the immediate dismissal of this pending case. The adjudicator did not hesitate. Motion approved. The case has been dismissed. Damon inhaled. He had emerged victorious. However, his task was not yet complete. Due to the fact that certain victories are more significant than a single case, Officer Manning was about to acquire this information firsthand. The gavel was struck once, with a firm and definitive impact. Manning was scarcely able to walk. Damon could observe the change, the realization that was gradually enveloping her, as she stood with her shoulders erect. She had entered this courtroom anticipating yet another straightforward conviction, another name in a system that rarely questioned her word. However, her identity was now the subject of investigation. Damon adjusted his suit blazer. His movements were deliberate and measured. He was not the type of individual to boast, nor was he the type to overlook mistakes. The judge's voice broke the stillness as he collected his possessions. Officer Manning, I must address a matter before we conclude. Manning immediately jolted to attention. Yes, Your Honor. The judge examined the officer with a gaze that had considered the fate of many before her, after removing her spectacles. Fletcher's case has prompted significant concerns, and the court does not dismiss allegations of malfeasance casually. I am currently formally recommending an internal investigation into your actions, as well as those in your previous complaints. Manning's visage vanished from Hugh. Your Honor, that is superfluous. The judge extended his hand. That is not within your jurisdiction. She addressed the bailiff. Ensure that my recommendation is forwarded to the appropriate parties. Damon observed Manning swallow forcefully, her fingertips contracting into fists at her sides. He proceeded forward, maintaining a steady tone of voice. Officer Manning, you were so certain of my guilt that you neglected to verify the information. Your decision is influenced by your bias. Before I had the opportunity to speak, you had already formed an opinion of me. She did not respond. Damon persisted, his tone remaining composed yet authoritative. This could have resulted in my termination from my position, my liberty, my reputation. However, I resisted, as I was capable of doing. As a result of my knowledge and resources, he allowed the information to penetrate his mind. However, what about those who do not? Manning's lips slightly parted, as if she intended to respond. However, no words emerged. Damon shook his head. How many individuals who resembled me have you apprehended? In what proportion of cases did they lack the resources to resist? The query was hanging in the air, weighty and damning. A man in a dark suit entered the courtroom, and the doors swung open. He was a representative of the police department. Before proceeding to the judge's bench, he engaged in a brief conversation with the bailiff. The judge nodded, before returning his attention to Manning. "Officer Manning, you are hereby placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending an investigation." Manning's visage contorted due to astonishment. "This is unjust." Damon exhaled quietly. "Neither was my arrest." The room was deafeningly silent. Manning was escorted out, her steps ponderous and her visage pale, as the weight of the consequences finally settled on her shoulders. Damon lifted his briefcase, rubbing his hand over the supple leather. This was not solely a personal triumph. There was something more substantial. Because today, a system that had previously been reluctant to hold individuals such as Officer Manning accountable, had finally taken notice. Damon exhaled profoundly, as he emerged from the courthouse into the midday sun. Although he was aware that it was not, the air appeared to be lighter and more lucid. The world had not undergone any significant changes in the past few hours. However, it is possible that one individual was compelled to perceive the situation differently. He walked slowly down the stairs, his mind still processing the events that had transpired: Manning's downfall, the courtroom battle, and the false accusation. It was a minor triumph. However, victories such as these were significant. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice. "Mr. Fletcher." Damon turned to observe the young officer from the precinct jogging toward him. This officer, who had hesitated when Manning handed over his wallet, had recognized the truth before anyone else had desired to acknowledge it. The officer paused a few feet away, allowing himself to recover his breath. I just wanted to say, what you did in there, that was something." Damon elevated his eyebrow. The officer scratched the back of his neck. "Indeed, I frequently encounter instances similar to this. Individuals are apprehended for no reason, and are unable to resist the system. It occurs more frequently than it ought to." He inhaled. "However, I have never witnessed an individual reverse the situation in such a manner, not even in court." Damon briefly examined him. "Do you ever intervene when you observe it occurring?" The officer's mandible contracted significantly. "It is not that simple." Damon observed him writhe, as he nodded. "Neither was establishing my innocence." The officer's shoulders drooped slightly. He was aware that Damon was correct. Damon's gaze returned to the courthouse's entrance. It commences with a single individual uttering a statement, performing an action, not merely ignoring the situation. The officer shifted on his feet. "Certainly." Then he gazed down again before rising again. "Look, Officer Manning is not the sole individual on the force who exhibits this behavior." His voice was now more subdued. "However, not all of us are as similar to her." Damon contemplated him for an extended period of time before responding. "Subsequently, demonstrated." The officer nodded once before turning and walking away, disappearing into the multitude of people moving through the city streets. Damon remained in place for a brief period, allowing the information to fully penetrate his mind. He had prevailed in his case, however. The conflict was far more extensive than his own. The number of individuals who would not have the opportunity to defend themselves in court was excessive, and there were too many who lacked the knowledge, resources or opportunity to fight back. That was the issue that necessitated modification. Prior to dialing a number, he extracted his phone and briefly examined the screen. The other end of the line was answered by a female voice. "Damon, is everything in order?" He offered a faint smile. "Yes, mother. Everything is satisfactory." She exhaled, her voice heavy with relief. "Very well. I have been in prayer throughout the morning." Damon's eyes were fixed on the streets below as he rested against the railing. "I believe I have identified my subsequent course of action." A moment of silence. "Oh." Despite the fact that she was unable to observe him, he nodded. "I am eager to initiate a project. Perhaps a legal defense fund, something that would assist individuals who are unable to defend themselves." His mother's tone became more empathetic. "That is a significant task, my dear." He grinned. "Indeed. However, I believe that it is the correct course of action." After a brief period of silence, she ultimately stated, "I believe you are correct." Damon reinserted his phone into his pocket.
He had entered the courtroom as a defendant. He exited in a different form, something more, because the purpose of today was not solely to cleanse his name. The objective was to ensure that the subsequent individual, who was falsely accused, would not be required to go it alone, and that was a battle that was worth engaging in.